The world was made of silence and stone. Up here, in the high lonesome of the Rocky Mountains, the year of our Lord 1878 felt like a rumor spoken in a distant tongue. Time was measured not by calendars, but by the slow crawl of the sun across a vast, empty sky and the deepening bite of the wind. The peaks were jagged things, knives of gray granite that tore at the clouds, their flanks scarred by old rock slides and cloaked in the dark, solemn green of pine and fir. Below them, valleys plunged into shadow, choked with timber so thick that daylight struggled to find the forest floor. A profound quietness blanketed everything, a silence so deep it seemed to have a weight, pressing down on a man, seeping into his bones until he forgot the sound of his own voice. It was a land of harsh, terrible beauty, a place that did not care if a man lived or died. It simply was. For days, the sky had been changing. The brilliant, brittle blue of autumn had given way to a high, thin haze, then a low, bruised ceiling of leaden gray. A strange light, flat and without warmth, painted the landscape in shades of pewter and ash. The wind began to speak a new language. It was no longer the playful gust that rattled the aspens, but a low, keening moan that slipped through the passes and sighed in the high branches of the pines. It was a mournful sound, a warning. The animals knew it. The elk had moved down to the sheltered valleys, the black bears were deep in their dens, and even the hardy mountain jays had fallen silent, seeking refuge in the dense thickets. Nature was holding its breath, waiting for the blow to fall. This land was not a backdrop for a man's life. It was an active participant, a force that dictated the terms of survival, that enforced a solitude so complete it could scour a soul clean or drive a man mad. Silas Blackwood understood the terms. He stood now in the clearing before his cabin, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only percussion in the vast, silent orchestra of the mountains. He was a man in his late 30s, but the lines etched around his eyes and mouth spoke of more years than he had lived, and more sorrow than any man should carry. His face, weathered by sun and wind to the texture of old leather, was a mask of grim control. Only his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, betrayed him. They held a deep, settled sorrow, the quiet grief of a man who has lost everything and expects nothing more from the world. Each swing of the axe was precise, economical. There was no wasted motion in him. He split the pine rounds with a grim efficiency that governed all his daily chores. The woodpile grew, a bulwark against the coming cold. Earlier, he had checked his trap lines, his worn boots leaving neat, lonely tracks in the first dusting of snow. He had found a plump beaver in one, a grim satisfaction in the small victory. He had spent the afternoon chinking the logs of his cabin with a mixture of mud and moss, reinforcing the seals around the single glass window and the heavy plank door. His movements were those of a man long accustomed to being alone, a man who had made a ritual of solitude. As he worked, his mind, a thing he could not always command, drifted. The sharp, clean scent of the pine pitch was suddenly the cloying sweetness of cheap perfume on a packed riverboat. The glint of the axe head in the flat gray light became the flicker of a lantern on a small, pale face, a ghost of a memory, hazy and unwelcome. His wife, Martha, her hair damp with the fever sweat, her hand limp in his, and little Sarah, their daughter, her breathing shallow, her eyes too bright. He could almost feel the phantom weight of her small body, a weight that had grown heavier and then terrifyingly light. The cholera had come upon them on the trail west, a swift and merciless thief. He had dug their graves himself in the hard Kansas dirt, wrapped them in their best quilts, and then he had walked on, leaving the man he used to be buried there with them. This cabin, this fortress of logs he had built with his own 2 hands, was his penance. His isolation was a shield he held up against the world, against the possibility of ever feeling such a loss again. Here, the only ghosts were the ones he carried inside him. The mountains did not judge, and the silence did not ask questions. He was safe here, not from the elements, but from the raw, open wound of his own memory. The blizzard did not arrive. It descended. One moment, the air was still and thick with anticipation. The next, the world dissolved into a maelstrom. The wind, which had been moaning, rose to a savage, shrieking howl, the sound of a starving wolf pack throwing itself against the walls of the world. Snow came with it, not in flakes, but in a solid, horizontal wall of white that erased the sky. The trees, the very ground beneath his feet. Silas had made it inside just moments before the onslaught, the heavy bar falling into place on the door with a solid, final thud. Now, he stood before the hearth, the fire roaring, its hungry orange light casting long, dancing shadows that writhed on the rough-hewn walls. Through the single window, he could see nothing but a churning, hypnotic vortex of white. The wind slammed against the cabin in violent, shuddering gusts, and he could hear the snow piling up in massive drifts, burying his small clearing, erasing every trail, every sign that a man named Silas Blackwood even existed. He was safe, warm, and utterly alone. The violence of the storm outside was a mirror to the tempest of grief he kept perpetually at bay. In the roar of the wind, he heard the echo of his own silent screams, and in the crushing, suffocating whiteness, he felt the profound weight of his loneliness, a cold so deep that no fire could ever hope to touch it. It was then that a new sound cut through the howl of the wind, a frantic, desperate sound, a weak but insistent banging on his cabin door. Silas froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. Visitors were unheard of. He had not spoken to another human being in 4 months. No sane person would be out in a storm like this. His heart began to pound a heavy, fearful rhythm against his ribs, a mixture of pure animal fear and deep, ingrained suspicion. Outlaws, maybe, driven from their camp by the storm, looking for shelter and an easy mark, or perhaps a prospector, one of the lonely, half-mad souls who wandered these mountains. His mind finally snapped by the solitude and the screaming wind. He reached up and took his rifle from the wooden pegs above the mantelpiece. The feel of the cold, heavy steel in his hands was a small comfort. His movements were silent, cautious, as he moved away from the firelight and into the shadows. The floorboards, old and dry, groaned under his weight, the sound loud in the sudden pocket of silence between gusts of wind. He held his breath, listening. There it was again, a frantic scraping sound, followed by 3 distinct, muffled thumps. Weaker this time. Whoever was out there was losing strength. He pressed his ear against the thick wood of the door, but he could hear nothing but the raging storm. He slid the rifle's stock against his shoulder, his thumb resting on the hammer. He called out, his voice a low, rough growl, rusty from disuse. "Who is it?" There was no answer but the shriek of the wind. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door. He held the rifle steady with one hand and used the other to pull the door inward. Just a crack. An arctic blast of wind and snow exploded into the room, sending ashes and embers swirling from the hearth. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of cold that stole his breath, and with it, a figure, a dark shape against the blinding white, stumbled and collapsed across the threshold, falling in a heap onto the floor. Silas slammed the door shut against the storm and dropped the bar back into place, his heart hammering in his throat. He stared down at the crumpled form. It was a woman, an Apache woman. She was soaked through, her buckskin clothing frozen stiff and crusted with ice. Her long, dark hair was matted with snow and a smear of half-frozen blood from a nasty gash on her temple. She was shivering uncontrollably, her whole body racked by violent, convulsive tremors. For a moment, Silas was paralyzed, struck dumb by a cocktail of shock and a lifetime of ingrained prejudice. His first, raw instinct was to unbar the door and force her back out into the storm from which she had come. He saw not just a person, a woman freezing to death on his floor. He saw a symbol of everything wild and dangerous about this land, a threat to his hard-won isolation. He saw a savage. He raised the rifle slightly, the barrel pointing toward her. His voice was low, hard. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman, Nita, struggled to push herself up onto trembling arms. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over high cheekbones, her lips tinged with a deathly blue. She was clearly exhausted, in pain, on the very edge of her endurance. But as she lifted her head, her eyes met his. They were dark and fierce, and in their depths, a wild, unyielding will to survive burned like a coal. She ignored his question. Her teeth were chattering too hard to form complex words, the sounds clicking together in her throat. Her gaze swept past him, past the threatening rifle, and fixed on the two things in the room that meant life. First, the roaring fire in the hearth. Then, the single narrow cot in the corner, with its rumpled wool blanket. Her eyes, pragmatic and desperate, locked onto the bed. She knew she was dying. She could feel the cold not just on her skin, but deep inside, in her marrow, a creeping numbness that was shutting her body down. She pointed a shaking, unsteady finger toward the cot. Her voice, when it came, was a hoarse, raw whisper, shredded by the cold. She spoke in broken English, the words stripped of all pleasantry, of all pleading. They were stark, simple, and absolute. "Share bed, share warmth." She paused, gathering what little strength she had left, her dark, burning eyes holding his. "Or I die here. You watch." It was not a plea. It was not a seduction. It was an ultimatum, a demand born of absolute, final necessity. It was a raw statement of fact, a challenge laid bare on his floorboards. She was not asking for his pity. She was challenging his humanity, forcing him to choose, right here and now, between the fears and prejudices that had walled him in and the simple conscience of a man. A long, tense silence descended upon the small cabin. A silence so profound that the raging storm outside seemed to fade to a dull roar. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the fire and the violent, uncontrollable rattling of the woman's shivers. Silas was at war with himself. Every warning bell from his past, every cautionary tale he had ever heard about her kind, screamed at him to refuse, to throw her back out into the white death from which she had crawled. She was the wilderness made flesh, a danger he could not comprehend. And yet, he could not escape the raw, undeniable humanity of the woman freezing to death at his feet. He saw the violent tremor in her limbs, the deathly blue creeping into her lips, the frost forming on her eyelashes. And then, another memory, sharp and piercing as a shard of glass, cut through the fog of his fear. Martha. He saw his wife in her final hours, shivering just like that. A terrible, deep cold that no blanket could warm. He remembered the feel of her skin, cold and clammy even as the fever raged within her. He remembered the helplessness, the agony of watching life slip away, of watching someone he loved freeze from the inside out. The memory was not a thought. It was a physical blow, and it knocked the breath from his lungs. With a shuddering exhale, he lowered the rifle. He did not say yes, he did not say anything at all, but with a heavy, resentful sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life, he turned and slammed the door shut, ramming the heavy bar home with a resounding thud. His actions spoke for him. He turned back to her. He moved gruffly, his touch awkward and hesitant as he helped her to her feet. She was surprisingly light, but her body was rigid with cold and mistrust. His movements were clinical, his eyes avoiding hers as he worked at the frozen ties of her outer garments. The stiff, ice-crusted buckskin was difficult to remove, and as he finally pulled it away, he saw that she was wounded not just on her temple. A deep, ragged gash on her upper arm was crudely bound with a strip of dirty cloth, the edges of the wound an angry, inflamed red. He set his jaw, a new wave of resentment and unwilling responsibility washing over him. The final scene of that night played out in a tense, suffocating silence. He led her to the narrow cot, the only bed in the one-room cabin. There was no thought of desire, no hint of intimacy. There was only the desperate, biological need for warmth, a shared animal instinct against the killing cold. They lay down on the cot, back to back, a chasm of culture, of mistrust, of history and fear between them. Yet their bodies, separated by thin layers of cloth, were pressed together in the cramped space. Silas lay rigid, every muscle in his body tensed as if expecting a blow. The feeling of another person in his bed after so many years of aching solitude was both a strange, unwelcome comfort and an exquisite torment. The faint scent of wood smoke and wet leather, the subtle weight of her body against his, dredged up memories he had fought so hard and for so long to bury. Nita, finally succumbing to a wave of utter exhaustion, allowed her body to go limp, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the heat from his body began to seep through her clothes and into her frozen core. The violent shivering began to subside. The fire crackled in the hearth. The storm raged outside, a wild and feral thing, and in the thick, charged silence of the little cabin, an unwilling and fragile truce against death had been forged. The silence was the first thing Silas noticed when he woke. It was a silence deeper and more profound than any he had ever known. A perfect, unbroken stillness that felt holy, as if the world had been washed clean and was holding its breath in reverence. The blizzard had broken. Through the cabin's single window, a pale, cold light filtered in, illuminating a world buried under a thick and pristine blanket of white. The snow had smoothed every sharp edge of the landscape, draping the pines in heavy ermine coats and softening the jagged lines of the distant peaks into gentle, sleeping forms. He was lying on his side, and the first sensation that registered was warmth, a steady, living warmth pressed against his back. For a disoriented moment, his mind grasped for a memory of Martha, a phantom limb of a life long gone. Then the reality of the last night crashed down on him. The woman, Nita. He became intensely aware of her presence, of the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, a soft whisper of life in the sacred quiet. The warmth between them was no longer a desperate, frantic measure against death, but a simple, physical fact. They had survived the night. Their shared body heat a small furnace against the storm, carefully, so as not to wake her. He slipped out from under the heavy wool blanket. His movements were stiff, his muscles sore from the tension of the night before. He stood in the cold morning air of the cabin feeling a profound and overwhelming sense of awkwardness. A strange vulnerability washed over him. His fortress had been breached, his solitude, the thick, calloused shell he had built around his heart, had been cracked. He was no longer just a man alone in the mountains. He was a man sharing his space, his bed, his very breath, with a stranger, an Apache woman. He felt exposed, as if she could see right through him to the broken pieces he kept hidden inside. He moved to the hearth and knelt. His back to the cot, he gently poked at the embers, coaxing the last vestiges of the previous night's fire back to life. He added small bits of kindling, blowing softly until a tiny, determined flame flickered and caught. It was as he was placing a larger log onto the growing fire that he heard a slight movement behind him. Nita was awake. She was sitting up in the cot, the blanket pooled around her waist. The pale light from the window fell across her face, showing the deep exhaustion etched there, the dark circles under her eyes. She was weak. He could see that, but the defiance in her gaze was undiminished. Her eyes, dark and watchful, followed his every move. She winced as a sharp pain from her wounded arm shot through her jaw tightening for a moment before her expression settled back into a stoic mask. The cabin, which had always felt like just enough space for one man, suddenly seemed impossibly small. There was nowhere to hide from each other's presence, from the unspoken tension that filled the air between them. They were two people who had shared the most intimate of human spaces, not out of passion or affection, but out of the grim necessity of survival, the knowledge of that shared warmth, of their bodies pressed together through the long, dark night, hung between them, a heavy and unspoken thing. Their communication was a sparse and clumsy dance of gestures and single words. Silas ladled water from the bucket into a tin cup and held it out to her. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching his for any sign of threat, before she accepted it with a short, curt nod. Her hands trembled slightly as she drank. He turned back to the fire and prepared a simple breakfast, a thin porridge of oatmeal and a few strips of dried venison. He set a bowl for her on the small, rough-hewn table and took his own to the stool by the hearth. They ate in a dense, humming silence. On opposite sides of the room, the small space a vast canyon of cultural and personal divides. When they were finished, Silas knew he could not ignore her injuries any longer. The gash on her temple had scabbed over, but her arm was another matter. The crude binding she had used was stained and stiff. He stood up and walked to the table. He did not speak, but simply looked at her, then pointed a finger toward her wounded arm. His expression was stern, the way a man looks when faced with a difficult but necessary task. Yet there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that was not unkind. Nita's reaction was immediate and instinctive. She flinched, pulling her arm closer to her body as if to shield it. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She had known only violence and cruelty from men who looked like him, men with pale eyes and hard faces. Trust was a currency she did not possess. Silas saw the fear and mistrust in her eyes, and he understood it. He did not push, did not demand. He knew that forcing her would only build the wall between them higher. He had to earn a sliver of her trust, however small. He turned away from her and went to his small collection of supplies. He took out a roll of clean linen rags, the ones he kept for himself. He placed a small pot of water on the hearth to heat. He retrieved a small, round tin from his pack, a salve his mother used to make from pine sap and herbs, good for drawing out infection. He placed all these things on the table next to her, the clean rags, the steaming pot of water, the jar of salve. Then he stepped back and waited, leaving the choice to her. He did not speak, but his actions conveyed a clear message. I mean you no harm. I want to help. She watched him, her gaze flicking from his face to the items on the table and back again. She looked down at her own arm, at the dirty, blood-caked bandage. She must have felt the feverish heat radiating from the wound, seen the angry red swelling that was creeping up her skin. It was a long moment. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath that was part surrender and part grim resolve, she relented, slowly, her fingers clumsy with cold and pain. She began to unwrap the crude binding. The scene that followed became a pivotal moment, a quiet turning point in the little cabin. The cut was far worse than he had imagined. It was deep, a ragged tear in the muscle, and the edges were inflamed and festering. The smell of infection hung in the air. Silas knelt beside her, dipping a corner of the clean linen into the hot water. "This will hurt," he said, his voice low and rough. She just nodded, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on his face. As he began to clean the wound, his touch was surprisingly careful, his large, calloused hands moving with a gentleness he had not felt in years. He worked slowly, meticulously, flushing the gash with the hot water, his fingers probing gently to clean out the dirt and grime. For the first time, he saw her not as an Apache, not as an intruder or a symbol of the wild. He saw a person, a woman in terrible pain. As he worked, he noticed the small, intricate lines of a faded tattoo just below her shoulder, a pattern of triangles and dots that spoke of a life and a culture he knew nothing about. He saw the proud, strong line of her jaw, the way she held her body perfectly still despite the agony he was surely causing her. He saw the deep exhaustion etched in the fine lines around her eyes, the sorrow that lived there, a sorrow that felt strangely familiar to his own. She watched him intently, her body tense, every muscle coiled and ready to fight or flee at the slightest provocation. But she endured his touch. She endured the sharp, stinging pain as he cleaned the wound. And she did not pull away when he carefully applied the thick, sticky salve to the raw flesh. The physical act of healing became a silent conversation, a bridge being built across the chasm of their two worlds. The shared pain and his careful, focused attention created a nonverbal dialogue of trust being tentatively offered, and cautiously, painstakingly, accepted. They were snowed in for 5 days. The world outside was a silent, white prison, and the forced cohabitation within the cabin became a slow, quiet process of discovery. A rhythm established itself, born of necessity. Each morning, Silas would venture out into the blinding white to chop more wood from the dwindling pile and to check the few traps he had set nearby. The hunting was poor, but he managed to snare 2 rabbits. When he brought them back, Nita, despite her weakness and the throbbing pain in her bandaged arm, insisted on contributing. She showed him how to properly prepare and stretch the rabbit pelts, her hands moving with an innate, practiced skill that made his own efforts seem clumsy and crude. She moved about the cabin with a quiet grace, and one afternoon, while looking through his meager stores, she pointed to a small sack of dried roots he had dug up months ago and largely ignored. Using gestures, she explained that they were medicinal, good for fever. They were 2 survivors, each with a deep well of practical knowledge, and a grudging respect began to form between them, an appreciation for the simple, hard-won competence of the other. Slowly, the dense silence that had filled the cabin began to be filled with words. At first, it was purely functional, single words spoken to bridge a gap in understanding. Water, fire, more wood. Then, one afternoon, as he was sharpening his skinning knife by the fire, he looked over at her. She was mending a tear in her buckskin leggings, her head bent, the firelight catching the black gloss of her hair. "My name is Silas," he said, the words feeling strange and loud in the quiet room. She did not look up immediately. She finished her stitch, pulled the sinew tight, and only then did she lift her head. She looked at him for a long time, her dark eyes unreadable. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The next day, as she handed him a cup of the bitter tea she had brewed from the roots, she spoke. "Nita," she said, her voice soft. The sharing of names was a significant step, a crack in the wall of their anonymity. It was an acknowledgement of each other's identity, a recognition that they were not just a man and a woman, a white man and an Apache woman, but Silas and Nita. A few nights later, the silence between them felt different. It was less tense, more comfortable, the quiet of 2 people sharing a space rather than 2 prisoners sharing a cell. They sat by the fire, the blizzard a distant memory, the world outside still and frozen. Silas found himself staring deep into the flames, and a memory surfaced, unbidden and with a painful clarity that made his chest ache. It was Sarah, his daughter, her face lit by a campfire just like this one, laughing as she tried to catch fireflies in a jar. Before he could stop himself, he spoke the memory aloud. His voice was thick with unshed grief, a raw, rusty sound. "I had a daughter," he began, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "Sarah." He told Nita not the whole story, but fragments of his loss, broken pieces of a life that felt like it belonged to another man. He spoke of the journey west, of the hope they had carried in the wagon like precious cargo. He spoke of the sickness, the dust, the endless prairie, and the 2 small mounds of earth he had left behind. He expected no response. He did not know why he was even speaking, but the act of saying the words, of giving voice to the grief he had held in silence for so many years, was a release, a lancing of a wound that had festered in his soul. Nita listened without interruption. She did not move, did not offer the empty, useless words of comfort that people spoke when faced with another's pain. She simply listened, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his memory. When he finally fell silent, the last echoes of his pain hanging in the air, she waited a moment, Then she shared a piece of her own. In her simple, quiet English, she told him about her younger brother, a boy named Taza. She told him how they had been gathering berries by the river when a rattlesnake, coiled and silent in the sun, had struck the boy's leg. She described the medicine man's frantic chants, the failure of the sacred poultices. She spoke of holding her brother's hand, of the terrible, creeping coldness she had felt as his life slipped away, a coldness that felt just like the snake's poison. By sharing her own specific, tangible grief, she met his sorrow with an understanding that transcended language or culture. She did not try to equate their losses, but simply laid her own pain beside his. In that moment, they were no longer just Silas Blackwood, the grieving white settler, and Nita, the displaced Apache woman. They were two people bound by the universal, terrible knowledge of profound loss. That night changed the atmosphere in the cabin. The shared vulnerability had forged a new and deeper connection. The constant physical awareness of each other, which had begun as a tense, awkward necessity, began to shift into something else. He started to notice things about her, the graceful economy of her movements even when she was injured, the way the firelight would catch in the black gloss of her hair, the small, rare smile that would touch her lips when he mispronounced one of the Apache words she was teaching him. She, in turn, observed the quiet competence in his hands, whether he was splitting wood or stitching a wound. She saw the deep, settled sadness in his eyes, but she also saw how, on rare occasions, it would give way to a flicker of genuine warmth. The final scene of their forced isolation marked the shift from survival to something more. They no longer slept rigidly back to back, a wall of mistrust between them. One night, a nightmare, vivid and cruel, clawed its way out of Silas's past. He saw Martha's face, pale and still, and he cried out in his sleep, a strangled, heartbroken sob that was just a single word. Martha. He woke with a jolt, his heart pounding, the ghost of his wife's name on his lips. He was lying on his back, and there was a light pressure on his shoulder. He looked down and saw Nita's hand resting there. She had shifted in her sleep, her body now turned toward his. It was not a romantic or a possessive gesture. It was a simple, human act of comfort, an unconscious response to the pain in his voice. He turned his head to face her in the near darkness, the embers of the fire casting a faint, soft glow on her face. Her eyes were open. She was looking at him. They lay like that for a long, silent moment, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around them. Nothing was said, no words were needed, but in that shared gaze, something profound and unspoken passed between them. The bitter, killing cold of survival was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being replaced by a different kind of warmth, the fragile, tentative beginnings of affection and desire. The great thaw began not as an event, but as a sound. It started as a single, tentative drip of water from a sun-warmed icicle hanging from the cabin's eaves. Soon it was joined by another, and then another, until a steady, rhythmic drumming became the new heartbeat of the world, a constant percussion marking the retreat of winter. The sun returned, a pale, watery disk at first, but gaining strength with each passing day. Its light poured over the landscape, and the world outside the cabin began a slow, magnificent transformation. The immense blanket of white, once so absolute and uniform, grew rotten and thin. Great patches of dark, wet earth appeared on the sunward slopes like emerging continents. The branches of the pines, long bowed under their heavy burden, shed their coats of snow with great sighs and shuddering collapses, springing back to life, their needles a vibrant, defiant green against the lingering white. The hard, gray faces of the rock-strewn ridges reappeared, streaked with meltwater that glistened like silver tears in the afternoon light. The world was revealing its true colors again, and the air, once sharp and sterile with cold, was now thick with the rich, loamy scent of thawing earth and damp pine. This physical thawing of the land was mirrored by the one taking place within the cabin walls. The brittle tension of survival that had defined Silas and Nita's first days together had melted away. replaced by a comfortable, familiar warmth. With the immediate threat of freezing to death gone, a new, unspoken question began to hang in the air between them. What comes next? The end of their forced isolation was imminent, and this knowledge brought not just relief, but a new and uncertain tension. Their domestic routine settled into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They were no longer two wary strangers, but partners in the small, shared world of the cabin. There were even moments of quiet, unexpected humor. One evening, Silas unearthed a worn, greasy deck of playing cards and tried to teach her a simple game of whist. She watched his demonstration with a quiet, focused intensity. And when they began to play, she proved to be a remarkably quick study. Her mind was sharp, her memory for the fallen cards flawless. She beat him soundly, and then beat him again, a small, triumphant smile touching the corners of her mouth as she gathered the cards. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and the sight stirred something deep inside him. In return, she began to teach him words in her own language, the sounds soft and guttural, so different from the hard edges of English. He would try to repeat them, his tongue clumsy and thick, and she would correct him, her smile small but genuine at his mispronunciations. The physical space between them had shrunk to nothing. In the evenings, they no longer sat on opposite sides of the hearth. Now, they sat together on the floor before the fire, a single wool blanket draped over both their shoulders, the heat of their bodies a familiar comfort. The desire that had been a fragile, tentative seedling in the dark of the storm had grown into a palpable presence in the small cabin. It lived in the quiet moments, in the spaces between their words. It was there in a lingering touch as he handed her a cup, their fingers brushing for a moment too long. It was in a shared glance across the room that held questioning. Before one of them looked away, he found himself watching the way her long, dark hair fell over her shoulder, the elegant column of her throat when she tilted her head to listen to a sound outside. She, in turn, would watch his hands as he worked, noting their quiet strength and competence, the surprising gentleness they possessed. The air between them was charged, a silent, humming current of awareness that was both thrilling and terrifying. But the thawing world brought with it practical concerns. Silas took stock of his supplies and felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The flour was nearly gone. The salt was a scant handful at the bottom of the sack, and his supply of coffee beans was critically low. The trip to the nearest settlement, a rough-and-tumble mining outpost called Dust Devil Creek, was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. The thought of the journey filled him with a dread he had not known before Nita's arrival. He was torn. The idea of leaving her alone in the cabin, vulnerable and unprotected, felt like a betrayal of the fierce, protective instinct that had taken root in his heart. But bringing her with him was simply unthinkable. The sight of an Apache woman walking into Dust Devil Creek on his arm would be like throwing a lit match into a powder keg. Her presence would incite immediate hostility, suspicion, and a danger far greater than being left alone in the mountains. They discussed it one evening, their unique conversation a blend of his simple English, her sparse Apache words, and a complex language of gestures they had developed over the weeks. He explained the need for supplies, for flour and salt, using his hands to mime grinding grain and sprinkling seasoning. She understood immediately. She knew the necessity of it, but her eyes clouded with a deep, quiet worry that mirrored his own. She understood the danger of the world beyond their sheltered valley. The morning he was set to leave, she pressed something small and cool into his hand. It was a piece of fire-hardened wood, no bigger than his thumb, carved into the shape of a hawk in flight. The detail was exquisite, each feather precisely rendered. It was a token from her people. She explained with a few words and a gesture toward the sky, for safe travels. He closed his hand around it, the smooth, carved wood a tangible link to her, a promise to return. Silas's journey to Dust Devil Creek was an arduous ordeal. The world, which had been silent and muffled under the snow, now felt loud and raw. The constant sound of rushing water was everywhere, as every gully and ravine became a churning torrent of meltwater. The trail was a treacherous quagmire of thick, sucking mud that clung to his horse's hooves and tried to pull the boots from his feet. After weeks in the profound silence of the cabin, the sounds of the world seemed to assault his senses, the angry chatter of a squirrel, the cry of an eagle, the groan of the wind in the trees. The town itself was a stark and ugly contrast to the clean solitude of his mountain home. Dust Devil Creek was little more than a single, wide street of churned mud, lined with a handful of rough, unpainted buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, a sprawling general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a small, dusty sheriff's office with a sagging porch. The air smelled of mud, manure, and stale whiskey. The place was populated by rough, suspicious-looking men with hard eyes and unshaven faces, prospectors down from the hills, lean ranchers in for supplies, and drifters with no particular place to be. As Silas dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching rail, he felt their eyes on him. He felt like a stranger, an outsider. The weeks of isolation with Nita had changed him in ways he was only just beginning to understand. The crude, boisterous world of men seemed foreign and jarring to him now. He pushed his way into the general store, the jingle of a bell above the door announcing his arrival. The store was a chaotic jumble of goods, smelling of pickles, leather, and chewing tobacco. A group of men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, drinking coffee and talking loudly. Silas tried to ignore them, moving to the counter to give his list to the balding, weary-eyed proprietor, but he could not help but overhear their conversation, and the words made his blood run cold. They were talking animatedly about a recent bit of Indian trouble. A band of Apache, they said, up in the Redstone Canyon area, had been cleared out for good. The talk was brutal, casual, and utterly dehumanizing. They spoke of the Apache not as people, but as pests, a nuisance to be eradicated. The men were full of praise for the actions of a wealthy landowner named Marcus Thorne, a man who had recently bought up thousands of acres of mineral rights in the territory. It was Thorne, they said, who had financed the volunteer militia that had done the job. They spoke of him as a local hero, a man of vision, a man who was bringing civilization and order to the wild frontier. Silas's stomach churned. He felt a cold dread begin to creep up his spine. Redstone Canyon was less than a day's ride from his cabin. As if summoned by the conversation, the bell above the door jingled again, and a man stepped inside who could only be Marcus Thorne. He was in his 50s, impeccably dressed for the frontier in a fine wool coat and polished leather boots. He had a thick, well-groomed mustache and a head of silvering hair. He moved with an air of easy authority, and when he smiled, it was a broad, charismatic smile that charmed the men around the stove. But the smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were a pale, cold gray, shrewd and calculating. He was the very embodiment of Manifest Destiny's cruel, sharp edge. Thorne greeted the men. Then his gaze fell on Silas, a face he did not recognize as one of his cronies or employees. He walked over to the counter, his smile still in place. "Haven't seen you in town before, friend," Thorne said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Hold up for the winter?" Silas nodded, his answers deliberately short. "Something like that." "Harsh one, wasn't it?" Thorne continued, his eyes roving over Silas's worn clothes, his quiet demeanor. He was probing, sizing him up. "I'm Marcus Thorne." "Silas," he replied, not offering his last name. He felt the predatory nature behind Thorne's easy charm, the subtle pressure of his questions. Thorne leaned against the counter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Good thing we finally dealt with that Apache problem up in the canyon before the snows hit. Nasty business, but necessary for progress." "Of course," he added, his cold eyes narrowing slightly. "It's always possible a few might have scattered when we broke up the main band. A man living out in the high country should keep his eyes peeled." He paused, then delivered the final, chilling blow. "In fact, I'm offering a handsome bounty for any strays found on my lands, just to tidy things up." The conversation left Silas feeling hollowed out, a deep and profound dread settling in his gut. He quickly paid for his supplies, the flour, the salt, the precious coffee, and left the store without another word. His return journey to the cabin was a frantic, desperate race against the fears that were now screaming in his mind. The abstract danger he had sensed had become a concrete threat with a name and a face: Marcus Thorne. He realized with sickening certainty that Nita was not just a survivor of some random tragedy. She was a witness, a loose end. She was being actively hunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuer. When he finally broke through the trees and saw the thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney, a wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. He urged his horse forward, his heart pounding. She was safe. He burst through the door and found her sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise and then softening with a relief that mirrored his own. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the terror of his journey and the loneliness of her vigil melting away in that shared gaze. That night, the emotional dam that had stood between them finally broke. After they ate, he gave her the few small things he had bought for her in town. It was not much: a length of warm, soft blue wool cloth, a small bag of sugar, and a bar of scented soap. It was a simple, inadequate gesture against the terrible news he carried, but it was all he could offer. She accepted the gifts with a quiet reverence, her fingers stroking the soft wool, her eyes wide with a pleasure that was almost childlike, and the sight of her simple joy, combined with the terrible knowledge churning in his gut, was too much for him to bear. The unspoken emotions, the terrifying fear for her safety, the deep, aching desire that had been building for weeks, the profound connection they had forged in the heart of the storm, were too powerful to ignore any longer. He sat down across from her, his face grim. "Nita," he began, his voice low. "In town, I heard men talking." He told her everything. He told her about the conversations in the store, about the volunteer militia, about the massacre in Redstone Canyon. He told her about Marcus Thorne. He did not have to explain what it meant. She knew. As he spoke, her face, which had been so soft and open just moments before, became a mask of stone. Her posture straightened, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, but he could see the fresh wave of grief and raw rage that burned in the depths of her dark eyes. When he finished, a terrible silence filled the cabin. He watched her, his heart aching. Finally, she spoke, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Redstone Canyon," she said, the words like chips of ice. "That was my home, my family, my clan." In the face of this shared knowledge, of the monster who hunted her and the world that wanted her dead, all barriers, all hesitations, all fears of their own fragile feelings, collapsed into dust. He moved in an instant, crossing the space between them and kneeling before her. He reached for her, pulling her into a fierce, desperate embrace. It was not just a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of protection, of defiance, a primal need to shield her from the world with his own body. For a moment, she remained rigid in his arms, a statue of grief. Then, with a shuddering, ragged sigh, she collapsed against him. She clung to him, her face buried in his shoulder, her composure finally breaking in a series of shuddering, silent sobs that racked her entire body. He held her tight, whispering her name, his own grief for his lost family merging with his fury and sorrow for hers. The moment was saturated with a pain so profound it was almost unbearable, but in it, there was also an intense, fierce intimacy they had never known before. This shared torrent of grief and fear ignited the desire that had been simmering between them for so long. turning it from a slow burn into a raging fire. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, her cheeks wet with tears, her eyes full of a sorrow so deep he thought he might drown in it. And he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and deep, aching need. It was a raw, hungry affirmation of life in the face of death, a defiant act against the world that sought to tear them apart. She responded with equal fervor, her hands coming up to clutch his shirt, pulling him closer. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loss, of shared survival, of the terrible, beautiful solace they had found only in each other. They made love for the first time on the bearskin rug before the fire. It was not just a physical act. It was the culmination of everything that had passed between them. It was the healing of each other's wounds, the merging of their two lonely, broken worlds. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains, they created a fragile island of love in an endless ocean of hate and prejudice. It was a moment of profound, tragic beauty, a desperate claim on life, and a silent vow to face whatever darkness was to come, together. The days that followed were a season of stolen happiness, a fragile and beautiful thing blooming in a world that would never allow it to last. A profound shift had occurred within the four walls of the cabin. It was no longer a simple shelter from the storm, a fortress against grief. It had become a home. The warmth that filled the small space now had little to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. It was a warmth that radiated from them, a quiet, steady glow of two solitary souls who had found an anchor in each other. Their interactions, once so fraught with suspicion and awkwardness, were now imbued with a natural, easy tenderness. They moved around each other with a familiar grace, their bodies accustomed to the other's presence, their paths weaving together in the small room without thought. Their conversations flowed more freely, a gentle stream of shared thoughts and observations. She began to teach him the language of the land as she knew it. She showed him how to read the story written in a track, how a bent twig or a disturbed patch of leaves could speak of the passage of a deer. She pointed out the subtle signs that foretold a change in the weather, a knowledge passed down through generations that was a constant source of wonder to him. Her connection to the world was a deep and ancient thing, and in her presence, the mountains felt less like a place of exile and more like a sanctuary. In the evenings, he would read to her from the one book he owned, a worn and battered copy of Shakespeare that had belonged to his father. She did not understand most of the strange, flowery words, the kings and queens and tragic heroes from a world so far removed from her own. It might as well have been the moon. But she would sit close, her head resting against his shoulder, and listen to the rhythm and cadence of his voice, the rise and fall of the unfamiliar words, a kind of music that soothed the scarred and weary places in her soul. Their love was a thing of quiet, simple moments. It was her hand finding his as they sat on the cabin step in the tentative warmth of the spring sun, their fingers lacing together without a word. It was the way he would gently brush a stray strand of dark hair from her face as a breeze swept down from the high peaks. It was a shared smile across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet joy they had found in this small, hidden place. For Silas, it was a reawakening. He had thought the part of him that could feel such things had died on the Kansas prairie with Martha and Sarah. He had believed his heart was a dead and barren thing. But with Nita, he felt emotions stirring that he thought were long buried, emotions that were deeper and more potent than anything he had ever known before. He felt a fierce, primal protectiveness for her that was a constant, burning coal in his chest. The thought of any harm coming to her was a physical pain, a prospect he could not bear. For Nita, who had known a lifetime of loss and the brutal, sudden violence of men, Silas's gentle strength was a revelation. In his arms, in the quiet safety of their cabin, she found a peace she had never believed possible. He had not tried to tame her or change her. He had simply made a space for her, had tended to her wounds and listened to her silence. He was the first man who had ever offered her kindness without wanting something in return. In him, she found a sanctuary for her grieving heart. Their tragic pasts were the dark, fertile soil from which this beautiful, unexpected love had grown, a love that was all the more precious for the sorrow that surrounded it. But their idyllic bubble, suspended in the vast wilderness, was always destined to burst. The outside world, with its hatreds and its greed, could not be kept at bay forever. The intrusion came on a clear, bright afternoon. A lone prospector, a gaunt man with a wild beard and desperate eyes, was cutting a new path through the high country, his mule trailing behind him. He stumbled out of the tree line and into their clearing by pure chance. Nita was outside, humming a soft, tuneless song as she hung a freshly washed blanket over a rope Silas had strung between two pines. The man stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened, first with the shock of seeing the cabin he never knew existed, and then with a deep, consuming suspicion as his gaze fell upon Nita. He saw not just a woman, but an Apache woman, living in a white man's cabin. He stared for a long, hard moment, his mind churning, before he tugged sharply on his mule's lead and retreated back into the cover of the forest without making a sound. Silas had seen the entire exchange from the cabin doorway. He and Nita locked eyes across the clearing. Nothing needed to be said. They both knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, what the man's silent, hostile stare meant. The secret of their life together, of her very existence, was out. The consequences were swift and brutal. A week later, with their supplies once again running low, Silas had no choice but to make the trip back to Dust Devil Creek. From the moment he rode onto the muddy main street, he could feel the change. The atmosphere was chillingly different. The prospector had spread his story. Where before there had been indifference, now there were hostile stares. Men stopped their conversations to watch him pass, their faces cold and hard. He felt their judgment like a physical weight. In the general store, the owner, a man who had previously been civil enough, served him with an undisguised and venomous contempt, slamming his purchases on the counter and snatching the coins from his hand without a word. As he was leaving, he passed the saloon. A group of men were drinking on the porch, and one of them, emboldened by whiskey, called out, the words loud and slurred, "Looky there, it's the squaw man." The term, one of the deepest and most derisive insults a white man could level at another, struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. The other men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The social prejudice of the time was no longer an abstract concept, a thing he heard others talk about. It was a solid wall of hate, and it was directed squarely at him. In the space of a single week, he had gone from a reclusive stranger to a reviled outcast. His reputation, what little he had in this rough part of the world, was destroyed. The rumor, of course, traveled fast, and it did not take long to reach the ears of Marcus Thorne. For Thorne, the news of an Apache woman living with a reclusive man in the mountains north of Redstone Canyon was not just idle gossip. It was the confirmation of his deepest fear, that a survivor, a witness, had escaped the slaughter. He saw Nita not merely as a loose end, but as a living, breathing threat to his entire empire, an empire built on a foundation of stolen land and cold-blooded murder. His ambition was a ravenous thing, matched only by his utter ruthlessness. A single Apache woman could not be allowed to stand in his way. He decided then and there that he would handle the situation himself, personally and permanently. He began to gather a few of the most brutal men from his so-called militia, men whose loyalty was bound to him by his money and their own shared capacity for violence. Back at the cabin, the weight of the outside world's hatred pressed in on them, a suffocating blanket of fear. The simple joy they had found in each other was now tainted, shadowed by the constant threat of discovery. The peace of their sanctuary was gone. They began to have quiet, desperate conversations about running, about packing what little they owned and heading further west or north into the Canadian territories. some wild and unknown place where they might be able to disappear and live in peace. But the thought of leaving was heartbreaking. The land around the cabin, the jagged peaks and silent forests that had first brought them together, had become their sanctuary. This small log building was more than just a shelter. It was the only home either of them had left in the world. To abandon it felt like abandoning the very heart of their love. The escalating danger brought the dark, tragic core of Nita's past to the forefront, a wound that had never truly healed. One evening, as a storm gathered over the peaks, the sound of the rising wind a low, mournful howl. She finally told him everything. She was haunted by the encroaching threat, by the face of the man who had destroyed her world, and she could no longer hold the story inside. She spoke in a low, steady monotone, a voice devoid of inflection or tears, which was far more chilling than any scream could ever be. She sat on the floor before the fire, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames as if she were seeing the horrific images of her past playing out within them. She described the surprise attack at dawn, the time of day her people called the ghost-facing moon. She spoke of the sudden, sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the canyon walls, a sound that had shattered the morning peace and replaced it with chaos and terror. She told him of the screams of her friends, her cousins, her mother. She recounted, in stark, visceral detail, watching from a hiding place among the rocks as Marcus Thorne himself, his face calm and detached, had executed her father, the clan's chief, with a single, efficient pistol shot to the head. Her father had been a proud, strong man, and Thorne had shot him down like an animal. She told Silas how she had only survived by pure, dumb luck. In the chaos, she had been knocked backward, tumbling into a narrow, brush-choked ravine. Her cousin, a young woman named Elan, had fallen on top of her, her body already lifeless. Nita had lain there, trapped beneath the warm, heavy weight of her slain cousin. For the rest of the day, she had listened to the murderers as they moved through the camp, finishing off the wounded. She had listened to their laughter and their crude jokes as they looted the bodies. She had listened to them celebrate their victory as the sun set, the smell of their whiskey and the smoke from their fires drifting down into her dark, silent hiding place. This confession was the story's emotional core of tragedy. It was a raw, unfiltered account of genocide, a story that stripped away every last romantic notion of the heroic West. It was a story of pure, calculated butchery. Silas listened, his entire body rigid, his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces in his chest. His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. His own grief, the loss of his wife and child to the impersonal cruelty of disease, a grief he had thought was the greatest burden a man could bear, suddenly paled in comparison to the sheer, deliberate brutality that Nita had been forced to endure and witness. His love for her, which was already a fierce and protective thing, deepened in that moment into a new and profound dimension. It became a feeling of absolute awe at her resilience, at the incredible strength of the woman who could survive such a horror and still find it within herself to love, to smile, to live. And that awe was mingled with a burning, righteous fury on her behalf. A rage so pure and so hot it felt like it would consume him from the inside out. He now understood the true stakes. This was no longer just about hiding the woman he loved from a prejudiced world. This was about defending her and the memory of her people from the monster who had destroyed her world. In that moment, the fog of his own grief, the aimless, solitary penance he had been living for years, was burned away. A purpose, hard and clear as diamond, crystallized in his soul. He would not run, he would not hide, he would not let that evil touch her again. This cabin, their home, their sanctuary, would be where they made their stand. The decision was made, unspoken but absolute. The next morning, they began to fortify the cabin. their movements synchronized, their expressions grim and determined. They were no longer just lovers. They were warriors. They worked together, turning their small, precious sanctuary into a makeshift fortress. The love story had now fully merged with a story of survival, and a desperate, final fight for a justice they knew the world would never give them. The days leading up to the inevitable were thick with a silence that was heavier than any storm. The atmosphere around the cabin was charged with dread and a grim, quiet anticipation. Spring had fully arrived in the high country, a vibrant, almost violent explosion of life that seemed to mock the grim preparations they were making. The aspen leaves trembled in the breeze, a brilliant, shimmering green. Birds sang their territorial songs from the tops of the pines, their cheerful melodies a stark and painful contrast to the silence of the two people below. The mountain air was clear and sharp, filled with the scent of sun-warmed pine and damp earth. It was a world pulsing with life. While Silas and Nita spent their days preparing for death, they worked together with a silent, focused intensity, a grim partnership forged in the face of annihilation. There was no need for words. They moved in concert, each understanding their role, their strengths. Silas, with his brute strength and practical knowledge of carpentry, turned their home into a fortress. He took down the heavy shutters he used in the deepest winter and reinforced them, nailing thick planks over the single glass window, leaving only a few narrow, horizontal slits for shooting. He buttressed the heavy plank door with a massive log, creating a brace that would withstand a battering ram. He spent hours meticulously cleaning his rifle and the spare one he kept, laying out his limited supply of ammunition on a blanket, counting the brass cartridges as if they were precious jewels. Each bullet was a prayer, a desperate hope for one more second of life. Nita's preparations were quieter, more attuned to the land itself. Using her intimate knowledge of the terrain, she moved like a ghost through the surrounding woods. On the main approaches to the clearing, she created simple but effective warning signals. She built small, carefully balanced piles of rocks on the edges of outcrops that would tumble with a loud clatter at the slightest disturbance. She tied thin strips of rawhide between low-hanging branches, invisible to an unwary eye, that would snap and alert them to an approach. She was not just fortifying the cabin. She was making the forest itself her ally, turning the wilderness into the first line of their defense. But their work was more than just physical preparation. It was a battle against the consuming tide of their own fear. The fear was a constant, gnawing presence, a cold knot in the pit of the stomach that never went away. It was there when they woke in the gray light of dawn, and it was there when they lay in the darkness, listening to the lonely sounds of the night. Yet, the fear did not drive them apart. It bound them closer, stripping away everything but the essential, desperate truth of their connection. They spoke little during those days, their words seeming small and inadequate in the face of what was coming. But every shared look, every brief touch of a hand on a shoulder, was freighted with a universe of meaning. They knew, with a certainty that needed no discussion, that they might not survive. One evening, on what they both felt would be the eve of the attack, they stopped their work. They sat together on the step of the cabin and watched the sun go down. It was a spectacular sight, the setting sun painting the jagged, snow-capped peaks in breathtaking hues of fiery orange, deep rose, and royal purple. The beauty of it was so profound, so pure and indifferent to their small, human struggle, that it was almost painful to watch. It was a moment of profound and sorrowful beauty, a final, perfect memory of the world they had found together, a world that was about to be torn apart. As the last light faded and the sky deepened to a bruised twilight, Nita turned to him. She held out a small, soft leather pouch, tied shut with a strip of sinew. "For you," she said, her voice quiet. He took it. It was light, and he could feel the faint rustle of dried leaves inside. "What is it?" "Herbs," she explained, her dark eyes holding his. "They are for pain, if you are hurt." She paused, and her gaze did not waver. They are also for a quick journey, if capture is coming, a sleep you do not wake from." The words hung in the cold evening air. The gesture was horrifying in its practicality, a chilling testament to the horrors she had already witnessed. It spoke volumes about the fate she feared more than a clean death, a fear born from watching what men like Thorn did to her people. Silas's throat was tight. He looked from the pouch to her face, and his love for her, his fury at the world that had done this to her, was a physical ache in his chest. He reached out and took her hand. "It won't come to that," he said, the words a promise he had no power to keep. He, in turn, had his own final preparation to share. "Nita," he said, his voice low and urgent, "if they get inside, if I fall, there is a place." He led her inside the darkening cabin and, using the tip of his knife, pried up 2 of the floorboards near the hearth. Beneath them was a dark, hollow space, just large enough for a person to lie hidden. "You get in here. You do not make a sound. You wait until they are gone. Do you understand?" He looked at her, his grip on her arm tight. "Promise me, Nita, you survive, no matter what happens to me. You live. Promise me." She looked from the dark hole in the floor to his desperate, pleading eyes. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She nodded slowly. "I promise," she whispered. Their conversation was a last will and testament, a final, heartbreaking expression of their love, a desperate desire for the other to live, even if they could not live together. That night, their last night of peace, they did not make love. They simply held each other in the narrow cot, finding what little solace they could in their shared warmth. The memory of their brief, stolen happiness was a painful, constant ache in their chests, a ghost of a perfect thing that was about to be burned away by the dawn. The attack came at dawn, just as she had told him it had in the canyon. The world was suspended in that quiet, gray moment between night and day, a time of ghosts and stillness. Then the quiet was shattered. A single, deafening gunshot ripped through the morning air, and a chunk of wood exploded from the cabin wall, just inches from Silas's head. He was already awake, already moving, his rifle in his hand. Thorn and his men had arrived. Through the narrow slit in the boarded window, Silas could see them, 4 dark figures positioned around the clearing, using the ancient pines and lichen-covered boulders for cover. Then Thorn's voice rang out, arrogant and cruel, slicing through the mountain air. "Blackwood, I know you're in there. Send out the Apache whore and you might just live to see another day. She's the one I want." The siege began. It was a desperate, brutal, and terrifyingly intimate battle. The clearing around the cabin became a killing field. The air filled with the deafening roar of the rifles, the sharp crack of Silas's return fire echoing Thorn's. The cabin, their sanctuary, became a shaking, vibrating prison. The smell of gunpowder, acrid and sharp, filled the small space, mingling with the scent of fear. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls, some punching through entirely, whining through the air like angry hornets. One struck the cast-iron stove with a loud, ringing ping that made them both flinch. Silas was a steady shot, calm and methodical in the face of the onslaught. But he was badly outnumbered. He knew he could not hold them off forever, but he was not alone. He and Nita worked as a seamless, silent team. As he fired and worked the lever action of his rifle, she was beside him, loading the spare weapon, her hands quick and sure, her movements economical and without panic. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the clearing, and she would point out the position of an attacker with a silent, subtle gesture, a slight nod of her head, a flick of her finger. She was not a damsel in distress, cowering in a corner. She was a warrior, fighting for her life, for her home, and for the only person left in the world that she cared about. The fight raged, a deadly stalemate. Then Silas saw one of Thorn's men break from cover, beginning a wide, circling run toward the back of the cabin, the one side that was a blind spot from the shooting slits. He was carrying a torch. "He's going to burn us out," Silas growled, trying to get a clear shot through the trees. But Nita was already moving. Anticipating the tactic, she grabbed the small, powerful bow and the handful of arrows she had fashioned with painstaking care while they were snowed in. She slipped toward the back of the cabin, where a loose log could be shifted to create a small opening. She moved with a silent, fluid grace, a shadow within the shadows. She eased the log aside, raised the bow, and drew the string back to her cheek. For a single, breathless moment, she was perfectly still. Then she released. The arrow flew true, a silent streak of death that caught the running man in the thigh. He screamed and collapsed, the torch sputtering out in the damp earth. Nita had saved them from being burned alive. They fell back into their rhythm, but the attackers were growing more aggressive, their shots more concentrated on the door and the window. It was then that Silas felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his side. A bullet had punched through a chink in the logs. He cried out, stumbling back from the window, the rifle clattering to the floor. For a terrifying moment, the world swam before his eyes, and a wave of black despair washed over him. Nita was there in an instant. She helped him to the floor, her face a mask of fierce concentration. She ripped a strip of cloth from her own tunic and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound. Her dark eyes locked with his, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a blazing strength and determination that seemed to flow directly into him. This moment of shared vulnerability, of his pain and her resolve, was a powerful, unspoken climax in the midst of the violence. His pain was her pain. Her strength was his. As the day wore on, the attackers grew impatient. The resistance from the cabin was more than they had bargained for. Thorn, enraged and unwilling to wait any longer, decided on a direct assault. "Cover me!" he bellowed to his remaining men. A hail of bullets slammed into the front of the cabin, a deafening drumbeat of covering fire. Through the smoke, Silas saw Thorn and one other man charge across the clearing, heading straight for the door, weakened, bleeding. Silas knew he could not stop them both. He braced himself against the wall, raised his rifle, and prepared for the end. Suddenly, Nita did something wholly unexpected. She rose to her knees, took a deep breath, and let out a piercing, high-pitched cry. It was a traditional Apache war cry, a sound that seemed to come from the very soul of the earth, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and 1,000 years of grief. It sliced through the roar of the rifles, an ancient and terrifying sound that spoke of loss and vengeance. The cry unnerved Thorn's man. It struck a primal chord of fear deep within him, and for a split second, he hesitated, his stride faltering. That was all the time Silas needed. He fired, and the henchman fell, his charge ending abruptly in the mud of the clearing. Now it was just Thorn. With a roar of fury, he kicked in the weakened door, which exploded inward off its hinges. He stormed into the cabin, his face contorted in a mask of pure hate, his rifle raised. Silas, on the floor, tried to bring his own weapon to bear, but Thorn was on him in an instant. The two men were locked in a desperate, close-quarters struggle. The fight was ugly, clumsy, and brutal, a battle of brute strength and raw exhaustion. They wrestled for control of Silas's rifle, their grunts and curses filling the small, smoky room. As they struggled, the rifle barrel swinging wildly between them, it was Nita who ended it. With a strength born of desperation and rage, she seized the heavy iron skillet from the hearth, raised it high, and brought it down with all her might against the back of Marcus Thorn's head. There was a sickening thud, and Thorn's eyes rolled back in his head. He collapsed like a sack of grain, stunned and limp. The fight was over. An abrupt, ringing silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the ragged, gasping breaths of Silas and Nita. Thorn lay on the floor, disarmed and bleeding from the gash on his head. Silas staggered to his feet, retrieved his rifle, and stood over the defeated man. the barrel aimed squarely at Thorne's forehead. This was the moment for justice, the moment for vengeance. The air was thick with hate and the metallic tang of blood. Silas looked down at the man who had destroyed Nita's world, the man who had just tried to kill them both. He thought of Nita's father, executed in cold blood. He thought of his own lost family, of all the senseless, brutal death this land had witnessed. He could end it. He could pull the trigger and send this monster to hell. But as he looked into Thorne's terrified, pleading eyes, he glanced over at Nita. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, full of pain and exhaustion. But in her eyes, he did not see the same murderous hate he saw in Thorne. He saw a deep and profound sorrow. And in that moment, Silas made a choice. Slowly, his hand trembling, he lowered the rifle. "Killing him won't bring them back," he said, his voice ragged and hoarse. His justice would not be the same as Thorne's savagery. The fight was over, not with the satisfying bang of vengeance, but with the quiet, difficult, and profoundly human choice of retaining one's own soul. The immediate aftermath of the battle was not a celebration of victory, but a descent into a quiet, ringing devastation. The fight had been won, but the home had been lost. The small cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a ruin. It was riddled with bullet holes, ugly splinters of wood marking each impact. The single window was a shattered memory, and the door, torn from its hinges, hung askew like a broken jaw. The air, thick and heavy, was a sickening cocktail of acrid gunpowder, fresh blood, and the dust of splintered wood. Outside, the clearing was a scene of grim carnage. One of Thorne's men lay still and silent near the tree line, his fight over forever. Another, the man Nita had struck with her arrow, was moaning softly, a pathetic, whimpering sound in the sudden, overwhelming silence. And Marcus Thorne himself lay unconscious where he had fallen, a dark pool of blood matting his silver hair. Silas, the fire of adrenaline that had sustained him now extinguished, slumped against the bullet-scarred wall, a wave of weakness and nausea washing over him. The wound in his side, which he had barely felt in the heat of the battle, now throbbed with a deep, searing pain. He was shaking, not from cold, but from the violent, shuddering release of a body that had been pushed far beyond its limits. Nita, moving through the wreckage like a phantom, was at his side in an instant. Her face was a stoic mask, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, dark and deep, held the raw shock and exhaustion of the trauma they had just endured. Without a word, her touch gentle but efficient, she pulled away the blood-soaked rag and began to tend to his wound, her movements sure and practiced. Once she had cleaned and tightly bound his injury, they moved to deal with the living. The act of tying up the wounded, whimpering henchman and the still unconscious Thorne was grim and methodical. They used the man's own belt and strips of rawhide Silas cut from a spare hide. There was no triumph in their actions, no satisfaction in seeing their tormentor brought low. There was only a profound and soul-deep weariness, the exhaustion of survivors who have paid too high a price for their lives. They had defended their home, but in doing so, its peace had been irrevocably shattered. It was no longer a place of solace, but a tombstone marking a battle. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, mournful shadows that crept into the violated cabin, they sat together amidst the wreckage. They did not speak. There were no words that could contain the horror of the day, no language that could bridge the silence that now separated them from the life they had known just that morning. He reached for her hand, and she took it, their shared grip a desperate lifeline in the overwhelming silence. They sat like that for hours, two lonely figures in a ruined home, watching the last light of a terrible day bleed from the sky. The next morning, Silas awoke to a world of pain. His side was a single, throbbing agony, and every movement was a fresh torment. But as he looked at the devastation around him, he knew they could not simply hide what had happened, could not simply bury the dead and pretend it was over. The world had come for them, and now they had to go out and face it. He had to go to Dust Devil Creek and face the consequences of their survival. He made his decision. He would not go with just a story. He would bring the evidence with him. He found a length of rope and, after Nita had given the wounded man a drink of water, he loaded the whimpering, defeated henchman onto the back of his horse. He roused Marcus Thorne, who was now awake, sullen, and nursing a massive headache. Silas looked at the man, at his expensive clothes now torn and stained with mud and blood, at the arrogance in his eyes now replaced by a simmering, impotent fury. "You're going to walk," Silas said, his voice a low growl. He tossed a rope over Thorne's shoulders, securing his hands. He would march the man into town at gunpoint. Nita came to stand beside him. "I will go with you," she said. It was not a question. Silas started to object, to tell her it was too dangerous, that the town would be hostile, but he looked into her eyes and saw a resolve there that was as hard and unyielding as the mountains themselves. She would not hide anymore. She would not be a secret to be protected. This was her fight, her story, and she would see it through to the end. He nodded. The procession that made its way down the mountain was a strange and solemn one. Silas, pale and grimacing with every step the horse took, sat tall in the saddle, his rifle resting across his lap. In front of him, tied to the saddle horn, Marcus Thorne stumbled along the muddy track, a fallen king being led in chains. Behind, the wounded man slumped over the horse's rump, and beside the horse, walking with her head held high, her back straight and her gaze fixed forward, was Nita. She was facing the town that despised her, walking into the heart of the hatred, and she would not flinch. Their arrival in Dust Devil Creek caused an immediate and explosive uproar. As they came down the muddy main street, people poured out of the saloon, the general store, the blacksmith's forge. Conversation stopped. Work ceased. Everyone stared, their faces a mixture of stunned disbelief, confusion, and raw, open hostility. The sight was simply incomprehensible to them. The wealthy, respected landowner Marcus Thorne, the man they hailed as a hero, being marched in as a prisoner by the town pariah, the reclusive squaw man, and an Apache woman. The crowd swelled, their whispers growing into angry, threatening murmurs. Silas and Nita ignored them, their eyes fixed on the sagging porch of the sheriff's office. They moved through the parting crowd as if walking through water. They marched directly to the door, a small island of grim purpose in a sea of volatile anger. The sheriff, a weary, pot-bellied man in his 60s named Jebediah, was sitting at his desk, staring at a pile of paperwork. He looked up as they entered, and his jaw went slack. He stared at Silas, then at the imperious woman beside him, and finally at the bound and furious Marcus Thorne, who Silas shoved into the room. Silas leaned against the doorframe for support, the journey having taken what little strength he had left. He laid out the facts, his voice low and clear, stripped of all emotion. He told the sheriff about the attack on his cabin, about the dead man he had left behind. He presented the captured, whimpering henchman and the defiant Marcus Thorne as proof. "They came to my home to kill us," he finished simply. Then he stepped aside. "She will tell you why." He let Nita speak, in the tense, crowded office, for half the town had pressed in behind them, eager to witness the unbelievable spectacle. Nita stood before the sheriff's desk and told her story. She spoke of the massacre at Redstone Canyon. She pointed a steady, unwavering finger at Marcus Thorne. "He is the one," she said, her voice not trembling, but filled with a cold, hard grief and an unshakable dignity. "He is the leader. I watched him murder my father." Her words fell into a stunned silence. She spoke with such authority, such profound and sorrowful truth, that even the most hostile men in the room were momentarily silenced. Then, the wounded henchman, seeing that Thorne's power was broken, seeing the grim reality of a hangman's noose dangling in his future, decided to save his own skin. "She's telling the truth. Sheriff," he blurted out, his voice cracking with fear. "Thorn paid us. He paid all of us. Said we had to eliminate her. Said she was a witness." The confession sent a shockwave through the room. The town was thrown into immediate turmoil. Thorn's powerful reputation, his wealth, his influence, was pitted against the word of an Apache woman, a social outcast, and a cowardly, captured killer. Some of the men in the crowd refused to believe it, shouting their support for Thorn, accusing Silas of lying. But others, men who had harbored quiet doubts about Thorn's sudden, spectacular wealth, men who had heard whispers of his ruthlessness, began to look at the powerful landowner in a new, uncertain light. Sheriff Jebediah, a man who preferred a quiet life, now found himself in the middle of a firestorm. But he was a lawman, faced with a credible witness, a confession, and 2 prisoners delivered to his door. He had no choice. With a heavy sigh that spoke of long nights of paperwork and the looming headache of a territorial judge's visit, he pulled a ring of keys from his belt. He locked Marcus Thorn and his wounded henchmen in the town's 2 dusty cells. Justice, in a formal, uncertain sense, had begun its slow, grinding course. Silas and Nita did not stay in town to see what would happen next. They left the sheriff's office and walked back out into the street. The crowd parted for them, their expressions now a confused mixture of fear, grudging respect, and a deep, lingering hatred that would not be so easily erased. They returned not to the violated cabin, but made a camp in a sheltered grove of aspens a few miles away. As night fell, they sat together by a small, crackling fire. They both knew, without having to speak it, that they could not go back. The cabin was no longer their sanctuary. It was a monument to a battle, its walls soaked in traumatic memories, its peace forever shattered. Their old life was over. The final scenes of their story played out under a vast, star-filled sky that stretched from one horizon to the other. They had survived. They had faced the monster and won. And they had each other. But the world remained a dangerous, hateful place. The prejudice against them had not vanished with Thorn's arrest. They were both scarred. He with a fresh wound in his side. She with wounds that ran far deeper and would never truly heal. Silas knew he could never fully escape the ghost of his first family, the quiet sorrow that would always live in a corner of his heart. Anita would forever carry the ghosts of her people, the memory of the life that had been stolen from her. By the light of the fire, they made a decision. They would leave this place, these mountains that had been both their crucible and their sanctuary. They would head north, toward the territories in Canada, a place they had heard spoken of in whispers, a place that was wilder, emptier, and perhaps more forgiving of 2 people who did not fit in the world. It was not a promise of a perfect life, not a guarantee of happiness. It was simply a glimmer of hope for a peaceful one, a chance to build something new on land that was not soaked in sorrow. The story ends not with them arriving at a new home, but with their departure into the unknown. They stood at dawn on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The air was cold and clean, and the rising sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks with a delicate, rosy light. They looked back one last time at the mountains that had forged their improbable bond, at the land that held so much pain and so much brutal beauty. They were leaving it all behind. The cabin, the graves, the ghosts. Then, together, they turned their faces to the north. Silas, stiff and sore, was on his horse. Nita walked beside him, her stride long and steady, her hand resting gently on his leg. They were 2 solitary, tragic figures. A man who had lost his past and a woman who had lost her people, who had found in each other a love strong enough to overcome a world of prejudice, a reason to face a new sunrise. Their future was a vast and uncertain territory, a blank map waiting to be written, but they would face it together. Their love was not a fairy tale ending that solved all their problems. It was a resilient, hard-won, and powerful force, a quiet strength that would give them the courage to continue the long journey ahead. The final image is of their two small silhouettes moving slowly across the vast, indifferent landscape. Together, a tiny spark of warmth and hope against the endless, empty horizon. Thank you for joining us at the Wild West Campfire. We'd love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe for more stories and share your thoughts in English.